Can I say that during the break, somebody came up to me who had been responsible for posting the photographs, taking photographs yesterday, which I spoke about this morning. He wants, through me, to apologise to all of you who have been upset by his doing so. It was, to my mind, an act of integrity and no little courage to come to me, seek me out and tell me that, and to ask me to tell you, which I would just like to recognise. He says he meant no harm at all. As I had anticipated, it was entirely one of those things which, understandably perhaps, people wanted to have a memento of being here. We now have the privilege of listening to Peter Burney, an unrepresented core participant. If you want it up or down, just up it. No, I think it should be fine. Thank you. I would like to offer my sincere condolences to all the families who have lost a loved one to this tragedy. It must have been an absolutely horrific position to find yourselves in, to watch someone pass through no fault of their own, especially as it was entirely through the negligence of others. In a country as strong as ours, who condemn the rest of the world if they infringe on the human rights of their citizens and take the moral high ground at every opportunity, whilst they themselves can stand by and watch the impact this contaminated blood tragedy has had on their citizens. That, to me, just takes the great out of Great Britain. One apology, an ex gratia payments, papers going missing, medical records being lost, politicians describing this as a cover-up on an industrial scale and threatening to go to the police. 2 sets of Health Secretary files vanished into thin air. This reads like a fictional Russian spy novel. But this is happening in our country. A country that our grandparents died fighting for, and a country they fought for is standing by and watching their descendants die, and have watched them die for decades, many of them victims dying in poverty, leaving their loved ones to have to depend on benefits and handouts, and their deaths covered up by governments who put money before life. All I can say is, shame on you. And when the truth comes out, which it will, history will not treat you kindly. I know almost every one of us, infected and affected, are really angry at the way we have been treated by previous governments and this government, especially the way this tragedy has not been recognised for a lot of its victims, where stigma has been attached, forcing victims to have to suffer in silence, afraid of what may happen if people found out they had a virus, and when it was discovered that they had a virus, they've had to move home because of hate slogans as painted on their houses, their children bullied at school, victims have lost their jobs, relationship breakups, then abused by the benefit system, which is still going on today. All this is because of the labels that are being stuck on the various conditions by the government, whilst trying to cover up what is most likely the worst scandal that modern-day UK has ever been involved in. They purposely ostracised us from the rest of society because of the diseases they gave us, when we trusted a system that was introduced to help us. Who in their right mind would admit to being infected with some of these conditions? I personally misled friends, family and neighbours. That is something I deeply regret, as in a way that means I am lacking moral fibre. Hopefully the public will get a glimpse of what we have had to suffer for decades, but that's all it will be, a glimpse. The public will never see the true pain and anguish we and our loved ones have had to suffer. The governments knew there was tens of thousands of victims dying out there, yet it was cheaper for them to let the virus run its course and watch us die. Each and every victim that passed was a victory to them, because they said he'd died as a result of alcohol abuse or liver cancer, medical staff kept in the dark about conditions, hepatitis not mentioned on death certificates. Hopefully, it will all be exposed. What we need is justice for ourselves and the victims' families who have lost a loved one. But remember, there is a difference between justice and revenge. We must all try and stay focused on achieving our aims and not let one detract from the other. We are fighting for victims who are no longer with us, and their families' needs are as great as ours, if not greater. That is why each individual infected and affected person has a really important role to play in this inquiry. The inquiry is specifically interested in hearing everyone's story. Some of you will have legal representatives, others won't. Your story will come in the form of a statement. I can't overemphasise just how important your input is. The inquiry will be looking for themes and similarities which may help them identify what has taken place and the extent of this cover-up. I know it will be difficult for a lot of you, as these memories are probably ones you wish to forget. When you give an account of what happened, please try and give as much detail as possible. Only you know what happened to you, and it's your statement. I chose to give my statement to the inquiry team. My way of thinking was simple. They are not influenced by any other motive other than getting to the truth. From my experience with them, they was courteous, professional, sympathetic, and they was very experienced in what they do. And they was very, very thorough. But what really grabbed my attention was when I found out the team was training up experienced lawyers to take our statements. I believe the inquiry team will be taking statements across the UK where people can go to them, though I think a lot of it will be London-based. I realise a lot of people may be reluctant to go public on this for various reasons. That should not be a problem, as the inquiry team have what they call a rapporteur, whose job is to take statements from various infected and affected victims. The rapporteur will go through statements and make a report, which will be handed to the inquiry team. He will identify any themes that become apparent to him. The inquiry team will go through his report, and once again, they will be looking for themes, or anything that may help them identify this cover-up. So again, the more detail, the better. And if you don't want to be identified, the rapporteur is an option you could use. We really do need to try and help ourselves as much as we can. No one will be as passionate about your story than you. There will be some people who feel a sense of relief after telling their story. I know I did. Because it was the first time I had fully opened up about what had happened to me. My wife was in the room to support me, and after they left, we continued to speak at length about how this scandal had affected us. This was the first time we have ever really spoke about it in detail, so it had a really positive effect on us. On the other hand, it may have the opposite effect on others, and it may upset you. If that's the case, I'm sure there will be people who will be able to help you. Remember, we have each other. And as infected and affected people, no one understands better about what we have been through and what we are going through. Me personally, I was given 2 blood transfusions, one in 75, one in 86. I became ill in March 2009. All the medical personnel treated me as though I was an alcoholic. That was wrong. It was eventually established I had hepatitis. In December 2010, my family was told that I had 2 weeks to live and that I would not see Christmas. then a DNR was placed against my name. I did live, and I was placed on the liver transplant list for 9 months. They then suspended me from the list, in their words, because if a liver came up that weekend, I would not survive the procedure. I had end-stage liver disease, hepatic encephalopathy, and I was in a terrible condition. Thankfully, I am now hepatitis C clear. The reason I am telling you this is if I would have been tested or made aware of this contaminated blood tragedy, my condition would not have got to this stage. A few simple lifestyle changes could have saved me a lot of pain and my family a lot of anguish. We have, at this moment, a wonderful opportunity to raise awareness of hepatitis B and C. Out of the 325 million people living with viral hepatitis globally, upwards of 290, that's 9 in 10, are living with hepatitis without knowing it. We need to encourage people to come forward and get tested. With the availability of effective vaccines and treatments for Hep B and a cure for hepatitis C, the elimination of viral hepatitis is achievable. If you was asked, have you ever had a blood transfusion prior to '92, you automatically think of a red bag of blood. Well, that's not the only thing you need to be thinking about. You can become infected by platelets, immunoglobulin, factor VIII, and many other pool products. Also, people who have received operations such as C-section births, dialysis, heart transplants are involved in any kind of trauma. In fact, any kind of surgery prior to 1992. The problem is, in a lot of cases, you was unconscious and probably unaware that you had been given contaminated blood products. So anyone out there who has unexplained liver problems, cirrhosis, and the doctors may be saying, well, it's because you drank in excess in your youth, then you should be looking at getting tested. Just try and be as assertive as you can and demand a test. It could cost you your life. The main bugbear for me is newborn children. Many was given blood at birth, and there is no way they would know that. And birth records are quite often destroyed. These children was born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, so by now they should be showing signs of the virus. I am the chairperson of a liver support group at Manchester Royal Infirmary, where we have found victims who have been transfused at birth and obtained payments from the Scripton Fund for them by using their parents' medical records and blood groups and birth certificates of infected children. These victims had previously been refused funding by the Scripton. Now, the reason I say this is we are not learned men, but when we heard the story of the application being refused, we adopted a common sense approach. Though there was no medical evidence as it had been destroyed, we explored a different avenue. We obtained irrefutable evidence, and after answering a few questions from the professors on the Skipton panel, both lump sum payments and annual payments was given. What intrigues me is why was this approach not used by the Skipton? We think it's because the Skipton wanted to keep the number of beneficiaries as low as possible, to try to hide the enormity of this scandal, and to try and minimise the financial impact on the Department of Health. In my opinion, that makes them complicit in this cover-up. We have no desire to steal any limelight from the inquiry, but while we are raising the profile of contaminated blood inquiry, we can reach out to people in a kind of Get Tested campaign or hepatitis awareness. We can give the government a chance to put right a wrong. They should have followed other countries' leads like France, Canada, and made an effort to find victims through advertising campaigns and contacting previously transfused patients. I know there was a half-hearted advertising campaign with dubious stigma-attached posters, just like a half-hearted look-back campaign, where there was another script the GPs had to follow to not give patients hepatitis blood tests or HIV. So it must have been difficult for them at that time, when their main aim was to, at that stage, it was to cover up a massive contaminated blood scandal. So, you know, this government may say, we can't put right the wrongs from previous governments. We've given more to the contaminated blood victims. And let's not forget the apology. They can make a massive difference now. Hepatitis can be beaten now with vaccines, and it will be cost effective to treat it now before sufferers get to the transplant stage. The Department of Health should make doctors offer the test, and even more so to people who have settled here from other countries where hepatitis is more prevalent. The UK was one of the last countries in the Western world to introduce a test for Hep C. And remember, I believe there are still a lot of victims out there who have been given contaminated blood products. Yes, they know they are ill, but they can't understand why. All we need to do is find them. And if we identify or save just one life, then this inquiry has had a positive impact. Another thing that bothers me is that the public may be led to believe that the cost of this inquiry or any other litigation that follows, the outcome of the inquiry, will come out of the NHS budget. We think it should be made clear that this is a problem that squarely lies on the shoulders of the government. And it will not affect the NHS budget in any way. And this message should come from the government sooner rather than later. We've been stigmatised enough. So I am aware that other people wish to talk to you, so I will make way for them. But before I go, I just want to make one more point, especially to the victims who are watching from home, who can't attend today's meeting. This inquiry, though welcomed by everyone within our community, will have a daunting effect on many of us, especially for those who are not able to be involved as much as they would like because of health problems or personal problems or both. Try not to let this inquiry take over your life or add to your anxiety levels. There is people out there from within our community who are more than capable of trying to get us all justice and are able to give evidence. Participate if you can by telling your story, because the inquiry is very much a victim-based inquiry. You will be contributing more than you may know. I know social media sites may feel like a great source of information, but try not to believe everything you read, as often comments are made from an individual's personal perspective, which may not represent what is actually taking place. There always seems to be difference of opinion in these sites. Try not to get involved, as these kind of confrontations always seem to take you to a bad place. Just try and respect other people's views, whether you agree with them or not, and don't try to force your views on them. People will keep referring to the Penrose and the Archer inquiries. Comparisons, all of it will be negative. But much was learnt from these inquiries, both by us and the present inquiry team. So hopefully we may be able to avoid some of the pitfalls. Those of you with legal representation should be kept in the picture by your solicitors. If you have a question for them, try emailing them. Then at least you will have a reply on an email. You may need it for reference in the future. Well, thank you for listening to what I've had to say, and hopefully this inquiry won't take too long. As I know, there are a lot of us out there who don't have the certainty or luxury of time. People may think that it's taking its time to get this inquiry started. Well, the more time spent on preparation may mean the less time spent on the actual inquiry. And failing to prepare is preparing to fail. I guess what I'm trying to say is be patient, stay strong, and above all else, try and keep well.
The next two statements to the inquiry by individual core participants are going to be read to you. That is their wish, and we are making sure that their wish is heard. Sarah Fraser-Butlin, Junior Counsel to the inquiry, will read the statement first of Andrew Bragg.
I'm a little shorter than the last person. Thank you, Sir Brian. The first statement I'm going to read is a statement on behalf of Andrew Bragg, an unrepresented core participant. He says this: "Due to work commitments, I'm unfortunately unable to attend the preliminary hearings in person. I would wish to make the following statements regarding topics which, from my experience, I would propose to be included within the scope of this investigation. Firstly, understanding potential infection risks from blood and blood products. The inquiry should include an assessment of what systems and practices were in place within government and the NHS from 1970 to assess the potential for the infection from blood transfusion and blood products. This should include to what extent information was gathered across the UK and also from other governments, research organisations and any other interested parties. Having gathered such information, how was this communicated within the NHS and government, and how was it acted on? Secondly, the use of risk assessment and action identified. Organisations must use robust risk assessment mechanisms to identify and respond to issues which may materially affect either the organisation or those it may have an impact on. It is clear that concerns about potential infectious agents in blood and blood products were in the public domain long before the NHS took effective action. It is therefore important to understand what processes were in place to collect information and assess risks. What were the mechanisms and systems in place to assess and act on potential risks identified with blood products and their use within the NHS? How were risks quantified and potential consequences and recommendations communicated? How were risks that were identified then acted on? What were the organisational systems and roles charged with acting on such information? And what were the individual responsibilities of those controlling these actions? Thirdly, the scope of potential exposure to HCV, HIV and other infectious agents. It would appear that there has been reluctance by the NHS to accept any responsibility for infections resulting from blood transfusions and blood products, and to then take action to respond effectively. Some questions which should be addressed are: once potential exposure of individuals to these infectious agents had been established, how was this communicated through the organisation? What actions were taken? How were individuals at risk identified, and what information was communicated to them? Who was responsible for coordinating these actions, and who was responsible for the delivery? What records of discussions and actions were taken? What is the retention period for these records? Fourth, interferon and ribavirin treatment for HCV. Prior to treatment with combined PEG interferon and ribavirin, there was extensive briefing concerning the risks and side effects of treatment, together with an assessment of suitability. The side effects were very significant, and the 48 weeks duration was a real test of endurance. However, following completion, the only medical interest was if the virus had been cleared, with no consideration of any other potential consequence of the treatment. In my case, in 2002, as soon as I had tested HCV negative for the specified period, I was discharged from the hospital with no further follow-up since then. The long-term side effects of treatment have been very significant. Personally, post-treatment, I have had a persistently elevated heart rate and high blood pressure, which requires daily medication. Other significant side effects have been fatigue and regular infections, which have implied a poor immune response. To date, I've had sepsis on 3 occasions and also pneumonia. It would appear that there is no referral system in place for patients such as myself, let alone treatment available. While I have cleared the HCV virus, I have been left with long-term effects of the treatment which have significantly impacted on my quality of life and work performance. I would therefore ask that the inquiry looks at what post-treatment practices are in place and perhaps should have been in place. An additional question would be to determine why there has been so little medical interest in post-interferon treatment conditions, given the numbers having completed interferon treatment and, based on informal information, the numbers having long-term side effects. Fifthly, external regulatory oversight. In the industry in which I work, we operate in the full knowledge that should there be a major incident, fatality or significant injury, then we will be subject to external investigation by regulatory agencies. We will be held corporately responsible, but also individuals may be held to be personally responsible. This responsibility sharpens the awareness and interest in the prevention of failures both systemically and individually. As an external example, it's 30 years since the Piper Alpha disaster. The Cullen report resulted in a significant change in the regulatory framework and to the external verification of practices within the chemical and offshore processing industries. The changes proposed by Cullen are still robustly managed and constantly subject to review, audit and improvement. For the NHS, such external oversight is largely absent, and it could be argued that the organisational response has been poor in this case, because neither the organisation nor individuals seemed likely to be held to account. External experience would suggest this is unwise. I would therefore suggest that the inquiry looks at whether there may be a role for external regulatory review of the NHS in the event of significant failings. Sixthly, corporate social and ethical responsibility within the NHS. Having become aware of the scope and potential consequences for individuals of infected blood, the NHS then failed to react in a way which can be considered as being either responsible or ethical. The failure to proactively seek out infected individuals and then bring the highest standards of treatment and support is truly scandalous. Yet, seemingly no one in either the NHS or government felt able to stand up and challenge the approaches taken. It would appear from the policies adopted that the principles of ethics and values, which are integral to the medical profession, do not seem to have been reflected in the wider management of this particular issue by either the health service or by government. Considering the actions which were taken, then a conclusion may be that the moral compass of these organisations has not been functioning in this case in the way one would expect. There is a wider question concerning if this is also the case in other aspects of these organisations. I would therefore request that the inquiry considers to what degree medical ethics have been or should have been applied across the NHS and by government in response to these blood infections. Seventh, the Skipton Fund and EIBSS. I only became aware of the Skipton Fund when reading an article about the establishment of this inquiry. As a result, I suspect that there is no routine referral of infected individuals to this support mechanism. Once aware, I made an application and have been rejected on the grounds that I cannot prove that the infection I had was the result of NHS actions. Any chance I may have had of proving this causal link has been compromised by the retention of only a limited amount of personal data by one hospital and the destruction of all of my files by another. As a result of the actions of these NHS organisations, and given the terms of reference of the EIBSS assessment panel, then I have no ability to prove my case. I would ask that the inquiry consider the following. Should it be the responsibility of an individual to prove that HCV was acquired as a result of action by the NHS, when supporting information is of poor quality or has been destroyed? Perhaps a fairer method would be for the NHS to prove it was not responsible for the infection. Why are elements of the NHS able to destroy patient records without the consent of the patient? Such information may be of value or use in the treatment of long-term conditions or for epidemiology studies. A related but wider consideration is concerning patient records not being centralised but widely dispersed and held only at the point of treatment. As an example, since 1986, I have been registered at 4 general practitioners and had treatment at 5 different hospitals. This does not support good medical administration or for instances that require consideration such as those that this inquiry is considering. Thank you. The second statement that I will read is on behalf of another unrepresented core participant, Stuart McLean. Stuart was given factor VIII and cryoprecipitate as an 8-year-old child. Stuart's situation is slightly different from many others here today, as he is not a person with haemophilia, but he has a medical condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which means he has no tissue around his joints, and as such he bruises easily. Stuart was given factor VIII as a child because of a swollen knee, and as a result, he was infected with hepatitis C, and like many people, he remained undiagnosed for 35 years. He wants the following statement to sink in to everyone for a minute. The NHS just celebrated their 70th birthday, but for almost 50 years of that time, patients have been infected or affected from treatments and left for decades without any warning that they might have been exposed to infection. And by this statement, it's not aimed at the frontline nurses, but the people who are in charge of the NHS, the Department of Health and Government. Today, Stuart welcomes the start of the public inquiry, and as a core participant, he is looking forward to working with the inquiry to get to the facts and the truth of why this scandal, the biggest scandal in the history of the NHS, was allowed to happen. Stuart's hopes are that any person or organisation that is found to have acted negligently, recklessly and irresponsibly, then these people or establishments are brought to account for their actions. But as Sam Stein QC said yesterday about 2 groups, haemophiliacs and whole bloods, there is also a third group, the misdiagnosed. So in fact, there are 3 groups of victims. Some of the issues that are important to Stuart are these. Firstly, why was this disaster allowed to happen? Secondly, why were victims tested without their knowledge? Third, why were infections hidden from victims? Fourth, he would like the inquiry to look at the consequences of infections, like losing careers, suffering breakdowns, depression, and other mental health issues. Fifth, the impact of regular cancer checks, hospital visits, and the stress and worry this causes. 6. What other viruses and infections have we been exposed to in the mix of factor VIII blood products, things like VCJD, and the increased risk of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, to name a few? 7. Stuart would like the inquiry to look into how the government have handled this scandal over the last 30 years, as it's shocking, as has been mentioned by others over the last few days. And he would repeat, "We the sick now have to fight for justice in this inquiry while fighting to stay alive. Sick people should not have had to fight for so long for justice. The government and civil service should be ashamed. Thousands of lives have been destroyed. Thousands of families have had their lives turned upside down. And thousands have died, and it's still going on today." Eight, Stuart would also like the public inquiry to look into how the schemes were set up and run. The schemes were supposed to help us and made us beg and have wrongly denied support to hundreds of victims. Stuart would also like to add, since this inquiry was announced by the Prime Minister, that over 80 more victims have died and that time is of the essence. If fault is identified, there needs to be action taken straight away as the inquiry goes along, rather than waiting to the end of the inquiry, because otherwise many people won't live to see justice. Many victims do not have time on their hands to have to sit through an inquiry and then criminal proceedings like the Hillsborough victims and families have had to endure. And we owe it to all the deceased victims and their families and the victims remaining that are battling this life sentence given to them through no fault of their own to provide justice. Most of all, Stuart would like the inquiry to leave no stone unturned, looking at every individual, company or establishment that is in any way connected to this scandal. Yes, speed is important to him, as people are dying from this still today, but a total thoroughness is more important than speed. He also hopes that all those that are involved, particularly government and the NHS, will be very open, transparent, and will supply all relevant evidence to the inquiry team so that they can carry out their duties to the best of their ability. And hopefully, after 30 years for some victims of campaigning, we will finally get to the truth, the answers we crave, and closure. Finally, what does he intend to add? Because he thinks it's important that all of those infected and affected contribute. Stuart has already obtained his medical records and is looking forward to providing his written statement to the inquiry. And he would urge you all, if you haven't already, to take action to obtain yours or your loved one's medical records so that you can pass these on to the inquiry or your legal teams. You can find guidance about how to do this free of charge on the inquiry website. Stuart runs a Facebook campaign group called Contaminated Blood Public Inquiry News, which will provide daily updates as the inquiry progresses. And his group is open to all victims, no matter how infected or affected. If you'd like to join, just get in touch and you will be welcome. Stuart also intends to work closely with the inquiry as a core participant, and he will give the inquiry team all the assistance he can. And he says, "Now let's get this started and hopefully get what we all deserve, justice and truth." Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Stuart. There is a slight change to the programme. Respecting the entitlement of core participants to be heard, those who are represented through representatives, but those who are not by themselves or by those who will read out their statement for them, it is the wish of Mark Stewart, an unrepresented core participant, to have his statement read by his daughter, Jade.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Sure? Yeah. This is a very brief statement. My name is Mark Stewart, and I have a mild to moderate von Willebrand's disease, and I was given contaminated blood factor A on the 12th of May 1981 in the Royal Free Hospital in London as just an 11-year-old boy. I have learnt from my medical records that I did not require this treatment. I was a previously untreated patient or a guinea pig. I contracted hepatitis C and was exposed to other fatal viruses thereafter. But despite this being known to my treating clinicians, I did not find out about my diagnosis until 2007, which is over 25 years later. Through these years, I had repeated blood tests and monitoring, but was not informed about my condition. I was given 48 weeks of treatment for hepatitis C with severe and debilitating side effects, including severe psychiatric injuries. I was made to pay for a substantial part of my treatment myself, but the treatment was ultimately not successful and the psychiatric difficulties continue. I want the inquiry to look at why I was treated with contaminated factor A when this was not necessary, and why I was not informed about my diagnosis at the time. I particularly want the inquiry to look at the position of previously untreated patients and the testing and monitoring of patients that took place without their consent. I have information that can help the inquiry from my medical records, and I want to participate with the inquiry to help find the answers. The contaminated blood scandal has absolutely devastated my family. My father and my brother were also given contaminated blood for von Willebrand's disease. As a consequence of which they contracted hepatitis C, they developed liver complications, and as a direct consequence of this, died. My brother Angus in 2013 and my father Angus Sr. died in 2002. I will be presenting a much more detailed statement when instructed, and I hope to God that the truth will come out.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jade. The next statement is going to be made on behalf of the UK Thalassemia Society. You have, those of you who have your programmes with you, you will see that it was to be by Dr. Christos Sotirelis. It will be by Rohana Maharaj. Rohana Maharaj.
Okay, hello everyone. Before I begin, I just want to say that I'm in awe of all the stories that I've been hearing over the past 3 days. We felt that we were alone in this, but now I know we have a family, even in this tragedy, but we are. Before I go on to explain what thalassemia is, because most of you I'm sure don't know about it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. So I'm a 29-year-old beta thalassemia major patient, and what that meant was that I am unable to produce red, hemoglobin. So since I was born, I've been having blood transfusions throughout my life. Last year alone, I received 110 units of blood and other blood products, and that's just 1 year. While I was lucky to not have contracted hepatitis during my time, many of our members in the society and my friends have all died from it. So I really hope this inquiry brings the truth out. So beta thalassemia, as I said, is a life-threatening inherited condition in which individuals are unable to produce normal adult hemoglobin. As a result of this, patients become profoundly anemic and require regular blood transfusions ranging from every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the severity of their case, in order to live. Thalassemia patients also receive iron chelation therapy in order to remove the excess iron they accumulate during these blood transfusions. The excess iron usually deposits in vital organs, consequently leading individuals to develop other lifelong complications such as diabetes, osteoporosis, cardiac disease, renal disease, infertility, liver damage resulting in hepatocellular carcinoma or liver cancer. Until 2008, cardiac iron overload was thought to be the main cause of death in thalassemia. Since then, hepatocellular carcinoma has been a growing problem for patients with long-term hepatitis C infection. Fortunately, transmission of hepatitis C by blood transfusions is now very rare, so the risk may be limited to all the patients who still carry the burden of the early infections. Now, as with frequent blood transfusions, the risk of obtaining blood-borne viruses increases. Many thalassemic patients became infected with hepatitis C during the 1970s and 80s after being given contaminated blood. According to the National Registry for Hemoglobinopathies, it is believed that there are over 1,000 transfusion-dependent thalassemia patients in the UK. Of these, it is believed that around 23% contracted hepatitis. There was an Italian study done a few years ago, and it is thought that approximately 80% of the adult patients who received blood transfusions before the year of 1991 have been infected by hepatitis C. Can you imagine the great scale of this? However, due to the funding restraints placed on the NHS, sufficient emphasis was not placed on record keeping, which meant that the incidence of hepatitis C for thalassemia in the UK is unknown. Liver disease in thalassemia is a medical consequence of both iron load and viral infection, mainly caused by transfusion-related hepatitis viruses. Liver disease is more severe in HCV-infected patients with active infection, and this may be compounded by hepatic iron overload. It is thus anticipated that the numbers of thalassemia patients who develop liver cancer will increase in the future, and it will be one of the leading clinical problems in thalassemia. According to a study done by Bogner and Pignatti, there has been an increase in liver cancer since the 1980s. Consequently, approximately 50 to 75% of these cases have been associated with hepatitis C virus, and with the risk increasing if patients are co-infected with hepatitis B. Only a few people in thalassemia have undergone a successful liver transplantation. A number of these patients have received several cycles of antiviral treatments between 6 to 12 months over the years, but they were proved to be ineffective for the more severe types of HCV. The increased hemolysis caused by these agents, frequently doubling with the patient transfusion requirement, restricted achieving optimal dosing, leading to the treatment failure after prolonged periods of the patients trying to cope with increased treatment-related iron burden, amongst other things. Now, as you can tell, there is a lot to do with thalassemia in one way, and now with hepatitis. So in most communities in which thalassemia was predominant, and thalassemia is predominant in North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Asia, and South Asia. So in these communities, there was an enormous amount of social stigma associated with just having thalassemia. With hours of blood transfusions, chelation therapy, social stigmatization, mainly because of the deformed external features that most patients have, social exclusion, patients and their families face significant psychosocial and emotional distress. For many of the affected persons in the UK, being a thalassemia patient resulted in social isolation, marital tensions, and stigmatization. The feelings attributed to the psychosocial burden due to thalassemia were then further reinforced by the stigma associated with hepatitis C. They combined a range of factors, including illness-related uncertainty due to their hepatitis C diagnosis, prognostic unpredictability, stigma, and discrimination. as well as previously unknown fear of transmission to others. They all cause additional stigmatization and increase the uncertainty and negativity about the future. We can all agree that treatment for thalassemia is extremely difficult and challenging in itself. However, with the additional burden of hepatitis, life became even more dire. As the treatment for hepatitis was brutal and in most cases unsuccessful, and with the thought of requiring lifelong blood transfusions, there was an additional fright whether patients would acquire any more blood-borne illnesses. This in turn negatively affected the need for wanting to get better, seeking and complying with the vigorous treatment regimes. Denial was also observed in a small number of families. Some families could not come to terms with thalassemia and more or less the reality of their child's new illnesses and denied it altogether. Now, on behalf of our members, I'd like to speak to the inquiry about what we think you should focus on. So I know a lot of the people who spoke over the past 3 days spoke about establishing the truth. The society would really like a real explanation as to how this atrocity happened. When did authorities, policymakers, the blood service know that the blood and blood products they were prescribing and issuing were contaminated? Who was responsible for continuing to use the contaminated products despite knowing it may have been compromised? Why was this injustice allowed? And if reports are correct, why was it swept under the carpet, and why were the medical records lost and destroyed? Has there really been a cover-up, as the reports say? What steps were taken to explain the risk of transmissions of blood-borne illnesses to patients and their families? Now, with regards to medical and psychological consequences, what were the other medical consequences caused as a result of contracting a blood-borne virus? And what treatments, services, and support were in place to help patients with this? Now, bringing the psychological burden to light, what about the distress caused to all those who were infected and affected, the lives whose dreams were unfulfilled, shattered, and destroyed due to the tragedy, the loss of educational opportunities, employment, relationships, and overall quality of life affected because of being given contaminated blood? Now, how are the affected going to be compensated? Will we get formal apologies from all the wrongdoers? Will the government explain what happened? And monetary. Now, there are a lot of patients who were made to feel that they were begging for charity when they applied to the various funds, which became increasingly difficult to access. Even today, with a simple change from the disability living allowance to the personal independent payments, patients are being sent to tribunals to appeal the negative decisions they received from PIP assessors due to the fact that their invisible illnesses doesn't portray on the outside. The members agree with the terms of reference set out by the inquiry, and we would like the inquiry to try to obtain all the relevant documentation from the NSA Trust treating thalassemia throughout the UK with the aim of trying to find out the exact numbers of patients infected throughout the years, as we are unable to find out exactly how many patients have been infected, and if they are deceased, to get to the bottom of the real cause of death, as in some cases the cause of death was just listed as thalassemia, so we don't really know what happened. We hope that the relevant bodies will cooperate with this. We are also really interested to work with the expert groups and the statisticians who and infection clinicians, because we have a lot of members and they've lived through a lot of circumstances. So we would like to work with them to try to get to the bottom of this. We hope that by having the core participant status would mean that we will be an active part of the inquiry, and we look forward to finding out the truth and seeking justice for all the patients and their loved ones infected and affected by hepatitis C and other blood-borne diseases. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. The Haemophilia Society are a core participant. They are represented by Raymond Bradley. He will now come and address you. You may need it a bit higher, but if you want to push that, it goes up. It's about.
Good afternoon, Sir Brian, and good afternoon, members of the public, ladies and gentlemen. I have a limited time frame of 30 minutes within which to address you, and I'm going to condense my opening statement, but I will be delivering a more comprehensive opening statement to the inquiry in written format. Also, at the outset, I wish to apologise for my dulcet Irish tones and any lack of eloquence on my part in terms of the enormity of the personal tragedy that we've heard over the last 2 days. As Sir Brian has indicated, I'm instructed and appear on behalf of the Haemophilia Society, a legal entity that has charitable purpose and represents the community of persons infected and affected by receipt of contaminated blood and blood products due to their bleeding disorder conditions. Those persons have lived quiet lives of desperation, suffered in silence, and have endured the tragic effect of their quiet lives of desperation and decimated futures. The Society carries a huge burden and has done so for many decades in terms of provision of support to its membership. For many decades, it has criticised government for its paltry, subsistence-like subventions that have added insult to injury and have created a fear within its community to take on the might of that government because of the potential withdrawal of such subsistence. The government has been anything but empathetic to the consequences that have befallen you as a very tragic group of people. It should be remembered that any nation is judged or assessed by the way it treats its most vulnerable citizens in their greatest hour of need. The Society, it should be remembered, comprises some 5,000 members. It is an organisation that has represented a myriad of interests, most particularly relating to those infected and affected over the past 33 years since the plight of HIV has reared its ugly head. There's an old legal concept. The concept of justice being delayed is justice denied, and it's very absent in your circumstances. An inquiry process ought to have occurred many decades ago, but the consequences associated with the delay of this investigation has resulted in many of those infected or affected not surviving to see the commencement of this inquiry, and in essence going to their graves without the knowledge of why their life was cut short and why they suffered to such an extent in advance of their death. In addition, the passage of time created additional psychological trauma for those who have survived to see the commencement of the inquiry process. Government has provided only subsistence-type payments to ensure that persons infected or affected would not have the ability to maintain or advance their own cause in an effective and constructive manner. So those persons were suffering both ill health and lack of financial capacity at that time, and therefore would be disadvantaged as a consequence. Such a scenario has driven a wedge within the haemophilia community, as conspiracy theories have run amok, there is little or limited basis for some perspectives. What is very clear is that vulnerable citizens have been denied justice, resulting in a very inward-looking consequence that ought not to have occurred, but was in essence a consequence of a failure of any proper humanitarian response by government. Given the limited time frame, as I indicate, a more comprehensive opening statement will be filed with the inquiry. We are now at the end of 2 days of opening statements, all of which have been very eloquent, and the Society supports and endorses each and every view that has been put forward to the chairperson. Many of those infected and affected have canvassed through the Society, and indeed the other representative bodies, Haemophilia Scotland, Haemophilia Wales and Haemophilia Northern Ireland, to seek justice over the years. I now wish to focus on that justice and how the society, my clients, will fight for justice for those infected by contaminated blood products and their families. Since the effects of this tragedy came to light, they have worked to improve healthcare entitlements, provide support and deliver care to those affected. Many of the trustees of the Society who commenced that work are no longer with us today. We remember their work and their objective of achieving truth, and we hope now to be able to deliver that for them through your work. The Society accepts that it ought itself to be investigated in relation to the various perceptions or criticisms that may exist in terms of its actions or inactions, and it welcomes such scrutiny, as it allows it an opportunity to be open and transparent associated with the events that so occurred. Yet, more than 30 years ago, the Haemophilia Society called upon government to launch a public inquiry into the infection of those thousands of its members with contaminated blood and blood products, in what has been correctly termed, during the course of the past 2 days, the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The Society demanded an immediate humanitarian response by government. After decades, and what I can only term an unconscionable delay, at least 2,400 people have died, and many thousands more who are needlessly exposed to hepatitis C and HIV continue to suffer with life-changing consequences. Those persons, as I've indicated, have lived quiet lives of desperation, endured decimated futures, and indeed suffered destruction of life itself. Eventually, government has finally begun to listen and has established this inquiry. It should be remembered the first duty of any government in any jurisdiction is to protect its citizens. If government fails in that duty, its secondary duty must be to do all in its power to redress the initial wrong. Yet in the circumstances of persons infected and affected by receipt of contaminated blood and blood products, government has consistently looked the other way and indeed refused to acknowledge the true scale of the personal and humanitarian disaster. It has been complicit in the covering up of this immense human tragedy. For over 30 years, various governments in this country have refused, neglected and omitted to put right its wrong. For that time, the haemophilia community and the whole blood community have had to fight unnecessary battles while suffering the devastating effects of terminal illnesses. And it should be remembered, those illnesses had connotations of stigmatisation and ostracisation. Many people have died quietly, away from the public glare and away from any campaign to achieve justice for themselves and their families. Too many have died not having even told their closest family members, due to the great fear, in particular, that the stigma of HIV infection could carry for that family. That stigma was largely created by government, and its rhetoric around the AIDS in the 1980s. Unnecessary, unwarranted and inappropriate connotations were propagated for whatever purpose. The after effects and consequence of that stigma continue to affect society in this country and indeed our clients' members and perceptions to this day. Accordingly, government, in terms of doing the right thing, have maintained their policy of dilatoriness. I'm going to bring you back to a little history. A legal action was launched in 1990 when matters were due to proceed to court. Government was encouraged, yet again, to do the right thing by vulnerable members of this nation. You. Somewhat uniquely, a very learned judge who was due to hear the case, Mr. Justice Ogden, wrote directly to government, as is referenced in his own memoirs. Also privately, he wrote to the then Secretary of State for Health. He set out what might be described as the moral dimension in this case. And he said, "A government which takes upon itself the role of public provider of medical advice and political service is in a very different position to any commercial organisation. It is clearly arguable that their duty to innocent citizens who suffer injury under the aegis of such treatment has a moral dimension, to which should distinguish their assessment of their position from the criteria to be adopted by the defendants of a corporate character." So he went on to say, "Government owes a duty wider than to its shareholders and its insurers. It should also mean that the public may be entitled to expect from a government an appraisal of their position which is not confined solely to legal principles to be found in the laws of negligence or indeed proof." He went on to describe your plight, the victims, as a special one. The response to that plea by the UK government of that time is nothing short of shameful. On the 2nd of November, the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, responded to a similar type request to be delivered by Mr Justice Ogwell. I'm going to refer to an excerpt from the Prime Minister's letter. She said, "I am sorry if this is a disappointing reply, but the government is showing its great concern for haemophiliacs with HIV by the ex gratia payments it is making. The question of compensation has been made a matter for the court to decide." So in essence, you take it as a community, you accept what you're given, and we, the government, on behalf of the people, will fight on against you in the courts, was the response. Some 2 months previously, my client's Haemophilia Society had received a response from Prime Minister Thatcher in the following terms. I want to refer to a second excerpt. "In the present case, the government has not accepted that the infection of haemophiliacs with the AIDS virus, tragic as it is, was the result of negligence, or that we should depart from the view reached by the Pearson Committee when it rejected the arguments with some generous scheme of no-fault compensation. In the meantime, I can assure you that we're doing all we can to help the court action towards an early outcome. If there has been delays from the original timetable, that is because of the inherent complexity of the issues, and certainly not because of our deliberate attempt on any scale to delay things. I'm sorry if this is a disappointing response or reply. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher." Persons with haemophilia at that time were dying as the complexity of the issues delayed matters, although there was purportedly no attempt on any scale to delay things. Government abdicated its responsibility to do the right thing by the haemophilia community and hid behind the concept of litigation to avoid its moral responsibility to you or to respond to the consequences of HIV infection. The true response of government has been to take advantage of its own vulnerable citizens, who in this instance were members of the haemophilia community, who at their greatest hour of need were obliged to sign up to a financial system to which every person who was so infected had to commit, in a form of moral blackmail. If everyone did not sign up, there was no benefit. That system paid minimal subsistence to those infected and affected, and in addition had a beneficial effect from the government's perspective that its acceptance denied the haemophilia community the opportunity to seek fair and equitable compensation. This stroke, and there is no other word I can use, was pulled by government on its own most vulnerable citizens at their most weak time. The society, whom I act, views such actions as a cruel and calculated attempt to subjugate its community into submission. Also, government insisted that the haemophilia HIV community sign away any rights to any further action relating to hepatitis C. When those persons had no knowledge of what hepatitis C infection meant, or even the potential lethal consequences. Yet again, in relation to hepatitis C, and sadly, once the magnitude of that infection became known, government failed to adequately deal with that tragedy and yet again put in place a further form of subsistence. Such a subsistence is not fair with equitable compensation, nor indeed did government provide adequately for the needs or requirements of the persons infected or affected. The consequences of subsistence payments is that persons are placed in a position of vulnerability and need, with the inevitable effect that such persons are made to feel in some way beholding for such payments. That is not an appropriate response of a government who has a humanitarian perspective upon matters, but in essence is the response of a government who seeks to achieve benefit at the expense of its own vulnerable citizens, you. Once again, the magnitude of the infection with hepatitis C when it became known resulted in government failing persons infected and affected. Government failed to adequately deal with the tragedy and yet again put in place what I can only describe as a further paltry form of subsistence. It failed to properly compensate for the devastating consequences visited upon your community. Yet again, people died without dignity, without knowing what would become of their family members, whose life path had been altered by virtue of the lack of financial resources available to them due to the illness and death of their family member. Also, such persons went to their graves without knowing what had occurred or achieving any semblance of justice. I wish to refer to another letter. This letter is dated 16th of May 1996, from then Prime Minister John Major, and indicates a very clear attitude of government and its perception of its duty to its most vulnerable citizens. The government has given the question of compensation very careful consideration, including the Irish scheme. I have great sympathy, but I really do think it is better to spend money provided for healthcare from whatever source on treating patients than on payments to people who receive the best possible treatment available at the time. I don't think many people in this room would agree with that statement. I am convinced that the best way we can provide practical help is to encourage research and best treatment for those infected, as well as supporting voluntary groups directly concerned with their care. We shall continue to support these efforts and explore other ways in which we can provide help. I am unable to comment on the possibility of any commercial company accepting liability through funding a settlement, and I do not think it would be appropriate to explore that. It is therefore possible that haemophiliacs and those suffering from hepatitis C might be able to benefit from lottery grants, but this would be a matter for the board to decide in response to any applications received. In short, the assistance contemplated or considered to be appropriate by UK government was the prospect of seeking lottery grant funding. That was the response to the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Also, government, I would submit, laboured under the misapprehension that they had provided the best possible treatment at the time. More than 3 decades later, the government finally offered an apology in the House of Commons. On the 25th of March 2015, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, was asked to ensure that there is a full apology, transparent publication, and above all, proper compensation for the families terribly affected by this scandal. The Prime Minister answered, I can do all of the 3 things he asked for. To this date, that particular commitment still remains outstanding. Prime Minister David Cameron indicated to each and every one of these people, "I would like to say sorry on behalf of the whole government for something that should not have happened." On announcing the establishment of the Infected Blood Inquiry in 2017, Prime Minister Theresa May acknowledged the following: "The contaminated blood scandal of the 1970s and 80s is an appalling tragedy. Should simply never have happened. Thousands of patients expected the world-class care of our NHS is famous for, but they were failed. At least 2,400 people died and thousands were exposed to hepatitis C and HIV with life-changing consequences." She also said, "The victims and their families who have suffered so much pain and hardship deserve answers as to how this could possibly have happened." She went on to indicate, "As Prime Minister, I am determined to stand up for victims in confronting justice and unfairness in a society at every turn." Whilst many of the infections that have tragically occurred happened over 30 years ago, those infected continue to die. Their families affected continue to suffer consequences. Such families, and many people in this room, are left in emotional and financial turmoil and continue to be beholden to government in relation to subsistence-type payments. Government's failure to adequately compensate, unlike my own country, Ireland, with a situation I would say was addressed after a time in a compassionate, humanitarian and appropriate manner, means that the haemophilia and whole blood community continue to be treated as second-class citizens in receipt of subsistence, or what your Prime Minister said were lottery payments. Although financial recompense will never heal completely the wounds that have been left to expand over decades, creating turmoil, adversity and anxiety for families. However, even at this late remove, some effort that is reasonable by government would be the commencement of the healing process. Having ignored the moral dimension, previous governments, present government, and indeed in particular the present Prime Minister, ought now to act on her own moral imperative. It is now time for this government, your government, to make good on its apology. Also, it is time the government commence the process of allowing healing to occur. It is a time to show that when government speaks, it is not just for delivering platitudes, as in past decades, but it is now acting to address the injustices of this heinous tragedy. Now is the time to ensure that no one who is infected or affected continues to suffer in a manner in which so many have before, and you have so eloquently outlined. Now is the time to ensure that in time those persons with a destroyed quality of life and those with decimated futures can exit life with dignity, safe in the knowledge that those who are family members or loved ones are appropriately provided for. Now is the time to ensure that those who remain will no longer have to fight unnecessary and divisive battles. Although justice delayed is justice denied, and it has been delayed, any justice at all, even at this late remove, will be welcomed by you. Now is the time to ensure that that justice is finally delivered. Successive governments have been the problem, who were unwilling to acknowledge the true extent of the health catastrophe that occurred and the moral obligation that arose. Government must now be part of the solution. The setting up of this inquiry is an incredibly welcome step. The work that this inquiry has to undertake is incredibly important. Also, the apologies of government so delivered and the empathetic indications so provided are welcome However, if this is to mean anything, government must ensure full and candid disclosure of what went wrong and why. Government should not rely upon legal, professional or public interest privilege in the context of this inquiry. In Ireland, government waived that privilege in the Lindsay Tribunal, and it should be sought by the inquiry that it waives as a matter of policy its privilege in relation to sensitive documentation, so that an all-encompassing inquiry can occur and you can get the answers you deserve. In Ireland, during the Lindsay Tribunal, the government waived that privilege. I have to say much of the interesting documentation that became available during that inquiry was the so-called privileged documentation. If the apology that has been delivered is to mean anything, action on fair and equitable compensation must now follow, long before this inquiry concludes its investigation. Time is of the essence. A model exists in my home jurisdiction, which I framed, that has been in existence for more than 20 years, to alleviate healthcare concerns, the financial requirements, and to provide insurance cover for people infected and affected. This allows people to live with some dignity in the context of their own quiet desperation. This allows people to have some confidence in what future exists for them. Also, the widows and the children of those persons who have died are fairly compensated through the entitlement to fatal applications, loss of society claims, etc. If matters here, in this country, are allowed to continue to fester, where government remains inactive, then the apology of government, the empathetic indications, are hollow in the extreme. Accordingly, the Haemophilia Society calls upon the present government and under Prime Minister Theresa May to provide immediate action in the following areas. 1. Financial support. At present, differential financial arrangements exist depending where victims were infected in the United Kingdom. You, as the infected and affected, are subjugated to a subsistence method that is dependent on a postcode lottery. At the very least, as an interim measure, all should be eligible for the same financial arrangements as exist in Scotland. Such a concession by government is only a start and is not the end of matters. Government ought to address the fair and equitable compensation situation they had previously refused in the context of John Major's letter relating to the Irish compensation scheme. More crucially, as occurred in Ireland, it is necessary that the compensation issue is addressed before the conclusion of this inquiry. We had compensation before the investigation was completed. Where you, as chairperson, have the entitlement to make an interim recommendation, the Haemophilia Society requests that the current postcode lottery of subsistent benefits would immediately cease, and as an interim measure, that the support available in Scotland would become widely available. Also, that the issue of compensation be addressed on the basis of the Irish scheme model on a moral responsibility basis, pending the conclusion of this investigation or inquiry, as requested all those many decades ago by the very prescient Mr. Justice Oglan. I want to touch on an issue that's a very sensitive issue, but I think it's necessary that we consider it in the context of the inquiry's work. Support and counselling. This inquiry will inevitably take the infected and affected on a roller coaster emotional journey, which will reveal old wounds and create new wounds and obliterate the coping mechanism of denial. In short, what is termed by consulting psychologists as both re-traumatisation and overcoming denial will occur. Essentially, this means the re-experiencing of emotions connected to past traumatic events. The psychological impact of events thus far cannot be underestimated. Many would be suffering already with undiagnosed psychological and perhaps psychiatric consequences. The inquiry process must be sensitive to such a scenario and provide comprehensive psychological and psychiatric supports at all stages to those who will be both attending the inquiry and indeed to those who are following its work from a distance. It is essential that this already fragile community is not further damaged. Many persons who have lost loved ones are outside the healthcare system and are not in contact with any support service. So it is essential that such a potential failure is addressed. The inquiry team has announced the availability of counselling support during these opening days of the inquiry, which is very much to be welcomed. However, based upon my experience in my home jurisdiction of representing many people, I believe that a much more permanent and indeed more comprehensive system must be set up as a matter of priority to provide an appropriate, compassionate response to people's needs and requirements as the inquiry progresses. I have taken advice from psychologists who work with people in your situation, and that is their recommendation. It would be fundamentally wrong and indeed potentially catastrophic to vulnerable persons for this inquiry to create through its very necessary work a re-traumatisation situation where yet again your community is left to its own devices to address such a scenario without the appropriate expertise or response or supports being provided. The inquiry has requested contributions on procedural issues, and I intend to address those exact issues now based upon my own past experience of inquiries. This is my third public statutory inquiry into the contamination of blood and blood products. It's my first in the United Kingdom. The Society's members wish to participate in a comprehensive, proactive and effective manner during the course of the inquiry's investigation. To achieve its members' objectives, I believe the following requires to occur. One, that all core participants have access to all discovery documentation. This is already indicated as being a right. Two, that all core participants have the ability to indicate what documents should be utilised as part of a core booklet for examination of witnesses. Three, that each core participant has a right or entitlement to examine witnesses in accordance with its legitimate interests under the terms of reference, arising from its core participant status. As I said, I have concluded 2 inquiries. In both, I represented victims like you. In both of those inquiries, that was the right and entitlement that was available. Anything less, I believe, is inadequate participation, and more crucially, it is unfair to expect the inquiry team itself to represent conflicting issues on any particular topic. Also, I would emphasise the equality of resources ought to apply to all core participants. In public statutory inquiries, I've seen victim groups, and I've experienced the consequence, have been entitled to participate on an equal footing of resources with government and others through subvention of the necessary expertise that is required by way of medical and scientific and other input. If the inquiry itself needs an expert panel to assist it, it is no different for the victim groupings. The government bodies already have access to the necessary haematological, virological and viral inactivation and other similar expertise. They are already on their payroll. Equality of participation means equality of resources. To participate as a core participant, nothing less is adequate. No constraints apply to government or indeed pharmaceutical companies in terms of resources. So you need to be able to be represented on an equal basis. I wish to endorse the comments that have been made to date in relation to medical records. Every personal statement, I believe, necessitates the ability to review, as a prerequisite, assuming the medical records are available, those medical records. To do otherwise creates a potential injustice for you. This is your only opportunity to tell your story, which ought to be accurate. You're entitled to know whether you had been informed of your diagnosis in a timely manner, whether there's any other information relating to you in your medical records that you would like to comment upon in your statement. All other inquiries have used medical records as a crucial and essential source of information. The time period of 21 days from the date of cost entitlement to prepare a statement is extremely limited. Obtaining the records and reviewing the records, which are undoubtedly extensive and comprise many medical charts and are often located in various hospitals, is a timely process. Often interviewing people for the purpose of taking statements is a very difficult situation for them and can take a number of meetings. All of the foregoing presupposes the ready availability of the entire of the medical records. I believe that there is a necessity for medical records to be made available for each and every person to be able to prepare their statement. I think there's a requirement for efforts to ascertain why so many medical records are not easily accessible, and that's an issue that needs to be addressed as a prerequisite. It should be remembered that the medical records are essential in relation to the following: ascertaining the infected product, ascertaining when the patient was informed of their diagnosis and whether it was timely, ascertaining if there were any physical examinations for signs of AIDS, ascertaining first abnormal liver function test results. Core participant status for the victims is to put the people at the heart of the inquiry. Failing to address these issues or anything less diminishes potentially the quality and extent of your legal representation and therefore your participation. I'm very much against time, so I'm going to summarise the next issue. There is an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the pharmaceutical companies. The Haemophilia Society and its members require this inquiry to investigate to the utmost extent of its powers those companies. Our clients believe the NHS was grossly negligent in allowing the utilisation of multi-donor pooled plasma-derived products manufactured from high-risk donors where such products were neither properly screened nor virally inactivated. The pharmaceutical companies manufactured and distributed those products to the NHS. The extent of the risk associated with those products, which your government or the NHS deemed acceptable, can only be ascertained by investigating those companies. I want to give an example, and it comes from the Crever inquiry, and it has relevance in this jurisdiction. In Crever, and it's a matter of public record, one particular pharmaceutical company was the subject matter of significant investigation. The allegations against that company were that after the introduction of heat treatment, which ought to have removed HIV from blood products, that it had a fatally flawed heat treatment process that transmitted HIV. It engaged a very eminent virologist, a UK citizen who was attached to the New York Blood Centre, who undertook assessments and confirmed the ineffectiveness of the heat treatment process. That company suppressed that research. The effect was that the product continued to be distributed. That product was utilised in Canada and was the subject and cause of infection of Canadian people with haemophilia. Subsequent to the Quiver inquiry, there was a criminal prosecution.
Would you like to take the next 5 minutes or so of what you have to say after lunch? We have to respect
Yes, of course.
those who are preparing the lunch for everyone, and they, I think, might like to hear you shortly after the break. How much longer do you think you might have? Bear in mind that the timetabling was done carefully to ensure that people had a fair opportunity to speak, and you agreed to a time limit which you're somewhat in excess of. I'm not objecting, but there we are.
Unfortunately, my clients have got 50% of the time of any of the other representative groups.
This is not the time for an argument about it.
No, it's not. I'm not arguing.
This is the time for lunch. Which
I appreciate that, but I'm happy to go to lunch.
Let's take a break then, now, and it'll be till 2:15.